This is you, you're an orange dot, of course, because you're a small group leader. And what other color would you be? So you're orange, and this represents, the small group that you're called to lead, and this represents right here, actually, one of the people in that small group that you're connected to. So if you were drawing this on a napkin, basically the first principle I would give you, and the first principle I would say, is simply that God has called you to be present. That ultimately, that's what you're to do as a small group leader. To decide you're going to be physically present in the life of a few people. You're recruiting leaders, you're recruiting other people to be physically present in the lives of a few, because there's nothing else that can substitute for physical presence. Now let me explain this to you for just a second. I believe with everything in me that you should spend as much money as you possibly can to help children and help teenagers. And you should fight for the budget you need to create great environments for kids and for teenagers. I believe in the excellence in production. I believe in the excellence in communication. I believe in all of that because we're trying to capture the imagination of children and teenagers, and I don't apologize for that. But let me say this also in relationship to that. All of that does not substitute for having a consistent adult in the life of a kid, a consistent adult who's physically present in the life of a kid and who does life with them. If you have to economize in a given year in your budget, don't economize relationally. Make sure that you're giving your attention and your energy to make those relationships have significance and have a place in your church and ministry. Because here's the reason why. You can spend your thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on production and on lights and on video and on all the tools. And again, I'm for as much of that as you can afford and you should leverage. But at the end of the day, there's another organization that's going to come into your city that will outproduce you in culture. It'll be Nickelodeon, it'll be Disney, it'll be Broadway. I'm just telling you, you can't compete financially with the presentation they can put on. But here's the good news. Don't miss this. They can't compete with what you can put in the life of a kid relationally. You should play to your strength. I don't care if you're a church of 50 or a church of 5,000. You should play to your strength, and your strength is right here, putting people in the lives of kids in a way that they're present. In this world where we believe in social media and we believe in using the techniques and all the tools that we can possibly use, don't misunderstand. Those things can never be a substitute for having someone who says, by being physically present in the life of a kid, I am going to show up for you and I am going to be there for you. And on my calendar, you are a priority to me. And I'm going to show you that because every week I'm going to be there. One of my heroes is a man named Geoffrey Canada. Geoffrey Canada was another education reformist, or is another education reformist. He's in New York City, and he created the Harlem Children's Zone. And Geoffrey Canada, there's a documentary that's out about him that came out a few years ago called Waiting for Superman. Maybe some of you have seen it. And the documentary is really built around his life, and basically because he grew up in Harlem, and he believed that Superman was real. And he believed that one day Superman would come and rescue him from Harlem. He said the saddest day of his life was when he recognized and realized that Superman was not for real. And somehow in his story, Geoffrey Canada ended up going off, graduating from Harvard, and coming back to Harlem. And I had the opportunity to kind of interview him and to talk about, his strategy and his philosophy of reaching the blocks and the neighborhoods there. And it is just really genius. I mean, he basically just started with one block, and he started, basically reaching in and rescuing kids there and giving them an education. His whole strategy is really simple. If he can get kids that are in those blocks and in those neighborhoods through college, their chances of going to prison drop 80%. So he's trying to get them from those neighborhoods through college. But in the interview, actually after the interview, after the video cameras were turned off and the lights were turned off, I'm sitting in the hallway with Geoffrey. And I said, if you could say anything at all to churches around the country and Christian leaders to engage them in the battle for public education, the battle for helping kids, what would you say? He said, there are a couple things that come to my mind. He said, one is, I would lean in to leaders and remind them that the reason there's so many kids like the kids in Harlem who grow up not believing in God is because there's so many kids who never have adults in their life that are God-like. They never have interaction with other adults who give them a resemblance or an indicator or a demonstration of who God is. And then he said this. He said the reason that the work of the church is so important and the reason it's so important to be present in the kids' lives is because you're connecting them to something that's bigger than just themselves. You're connecting them to a community of faith, and that's what being present means. And this is what he said. One of the biggest things the church can do, the greatest missions the church can have in communities where there are children and teenagers, is to be present in their lives so that they can understand what it means to have someone forgive them. Because most kids grow up in so many of these environments and they've never had an adult, a caring person who gave them a sense of belonging and somebody who believes in them who would actually forgive them for something they did wrong. So they don't know the power of being forgiven and restarting their life. I just think we got to recruit a generation of leaders and just lean into them and say, listen, we just need to be present. We need you to be present. We need you. What that means, and we've got some practical applications for each one of these that will help. What that means is we want you to show up predictably. Show up consistently. We're recruiting leaders and saying to those leaders, no, we don't want you to be here every other week or every month. We want you to work toward being in a kid's life predictably for a season of time. That season of time looks different for children in preschool than it might for teenagers. Actually, the older they get, the more we would like for you to consider, being connected to them for a period of years so you can earn relational change in your pocket. But what we're asking you to do is to show up predictably. We're also asking you to show up mentally. This is part of your job description. That we want you to tune in, and that means you want to turn some things off so that you are there in their life and you're prepared and you're ready for whatever the lesson is, whatever it is we're going to talk about, whatever the bottom line is that we want to connect them to, the piece of faith that we want them to understand and wrestle with. We want you to kind of have done your homework and to show up predictably, show up mentally, and to show up randomly. You say, what does that mean? That you use social media, that you use other tools, that you are in a kid's life predictably and you're tuning into them mentally, so from time to time when they're taking an exam or when they're showing up at their graduation, that you're there to be one of the cheerleaders, one of the fans in their life who've shown up to remind them that there's someone who believes in them and someone who cares. I can't begin to tell you the stories. We're going to unpack some of this in the session after this, specifically for those of you who work with children, those who work with students, to kind of show what this looks like. But I can't count the times I've had small group, teenagers, or teenage girls or guys say, hey, you know what, I got a text from my small group leader. They knew I was taking an exam tomorrow, and they just sent me a message. You have no idea what it means to me to know there's another adult in my life who cares and who is interested in what happens in my life. So we're asking you to be present. Be present and show up predictably, show up mentally, show up randomly.